There are moments when your spirit already understands what needs to happen long before your thoughts agree to it, and the real struggle is not usually a lack of direction, but the noise within you that keeps interrupting what heaven has been whispering all along. So let yourself settle here for a moment and consider the possibility that this message is not random, not casual, and not meant for every passing ear. Some people hear words like these and dismiss them as metaphor exaggeration or religious poetry, but you feel something deeper when truth brushes against your life. You have always sensed that your path carries a different kind of weight, that your battles do not always begin in visible places, and that the pressure you have endured cannot be explained by ordinary language alone. If that is you, then you are not here by accident. You are here because part of your spirit is tired of fighting half awake. You are here because something in you is beginning to understand that God never sent you into this life empty-handed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you keep listening, allow yourself to consider a truth that may change the way you see every struggle you have been facing. God has already placed spiritual weapons within your life, but many of them remain unused, not because they are weak, but because no one ever taught you to recognize them. That is where this journey begins. Not with panic, not with spectacle, and not with the kind of dramatic language that makes everything sound powerful while leaving you unchanged. It begins with recognition. Because one of the quietest tragedies in a spiritual life is not that a person has no help, but that they have help they do not know how to use. You may have spent years asking God to give you strength while overlooking the strength He already planted in your spirit. You may have prayed for protection while ignoring the wisdom, discernment, restraint, and holy habits that were already meant to guard your path. You may have asked heaven to fight for you while still speaking, reacting, and deciding as if you had been abandoned to your own understanding. That does not mean you are faithless. It means you are human, and like many people who carry a real calling, you have had to learn slowly that spiritual warfare is not always loud. Sometimes it comes as confusion that stays longer than it should. Sometimes it comes as fatigue with no obvious source. Sometimes it comes as repeating patterns, strange delays, draining relationships. Mental fog, misplaced guilt, or the constant temptation to respond to spiritual problems with purely emotional tools. And that is why so many chosen ones feel worn down even while loving God. They are trying to win invisible battles with visible habits alone. They are using effort where God meant for them to use authority. They are using anxiety where God meant for them to use trust. They are using reaction where God meant for them to use wisdom. They are using self-defense where God meant for them to use surrender and obedience. It is like standing in a dark room with a lamp in your hand while begging for sunrise, not realizing that heaven has already placed enough light within reach for your next step. The weapon is there, but it remains inactive until you understand what it is and why it matters. You need to hear this clearly at the very beginning because it will shape everything that follows. A spiritual weapon is not always something dramatic. It is not always an extraordinary moment, a public victory, or some visible sign that makes other people admire your faith. Often it is quiet. Often it looks ordinary to the outside world. Often it operates beneath the level of applause. But what makes it powerful is not how impressive it seems to people. What makes it powerful is that it aligns you with God. And anything that aligns you with God becomes stronger than what opposes you. That is why the enemy prefers your ignorance over your destruction. Destruction is loud and attracts prayer. Ignorance is subtle and can continue for years. If you do not know what God has given you, you will keep living beneath your covering while wondering why life feels harder than it should. If you do not know what belongs in your hands, you will misread your own life and call yourself weak when in truth you are simply untrained. There is a difference between being empty and being unawakened. You are not empty. You are not abandoned. You are not unequipped. What you may be is disconnected from the arsenal God has already woven into your walk with Him. And that disconnection creates a very particular kind of pain. It makes you doubt yourself when you should be deepening your understanding. It makes you question your value when you should be strengthening your posture. It makes you feel constantly behind, as if everyone else has access to something you missed, when in reality, much of your frustration comes from not recognizing how heaven works. God often places power inside practices that seem simple. He hides strength inside obedience, clarity inside stillness, protection inside discernment, victory inside restraint, and endurance inside faith. Human pride tends to overlook these because the flesh likes what is immediate, dramatic, and externally visible. But God, with His perfect wisdom, often arms you in ways that require maturity to appreciate. You may already be remembering moments when you sensed this. Times when you almost said something and stopped only to realize later that silence protected you. Times when you felt a warning in your spirit before a person revealed their true intentions. Times when a verse returned to your mind at the exact moment you needed it. Times when a simple prayer shifted your whole emotional state. Times when obeying God felt inconvenient at first, but saved you from something deeper. These were not random moments. These were glimpses of what has always been available to you. Heaven has been tutoring you even through your confusion. God has not despised your slowness. He has been patient with your process. And even now, as you begin to see more clearly, you may notice that your past battles were not meaningless. They were exposing where you were fighting uncovered. They were showing you the cost of not yet understanding your weapons. This matters because the season you are entering cannot be handled with the same spiritual passivity that may have marked earlier chapters of your life. There comes a point when comfort stops being harmless and starts becoming costly. There comes a point when drifting stops being rest and starts becoming vulnerability. There comes a point when God, in His mercy, begins waking you up not to shame you, but to train you. That awakening can feel uncomfortable because it forces you to confront how often you have underestimated what God placed inside your life. But it is also liberating because once you begin to recognize your spiritual weapons, you stop moving through life like someone at the mercy of every atmosphere. You begin to carry yourself differently. Not arrogantly, not harshly, not with religious performance, but with a steadier center. You start to understand that peace is not passivity. Wisdom is not weakness. Obedience is not small. Prayer is not last resort language. Scripture is not decorative comfort. Discernment is not paranoia. Silence is not surrender to injustice. These are not fragile things. In the hands of a yielded soul, these are instruments of war. So section 1 is not merely an introduction, it is a return to awareness. It is the opening of your eyes to the possibility that the reason you have felt stretched, tired, and spiritually overworked is not because God failed to provide for you, but because you have been living with treasures you have not fully unpacked. And that realization should not fill you with guilt. It should fill you with hope. Because if the weapons are already given, then your future is not waiting on heaven to invent something new. Your future may be waiting on you to recognize what has been near you all along. That changes the whole emotional atmosphere of your journey. You are not begging from emptiness. You are awakening to inheritance. You are not trying to become someone else. You are learning how to stand as the person God has already been forming through every trial, every delay, every lesson, and every unseen rescue. And from here, the path becomes clearer. Because once you accept that God has already armed you, the next question is no longer whether help exists. The next question is whether you will learn to see with greater depth than appearance alone. Whether you will stop measuring reality only by what the eye can confirm. Whether you will begin to notice the holy intelligence God uses to protect the lives of those who belong to Him. That is where the next layer opens, and it begins with learning how to recognize what your spirit has often sensed before your mind knew how to name it. As that awareness begins to settle into you, the first weapon starts to come into focus with greater clarity, and it is one many people ignore. Because it does not always arrive with thunder. It often comes quietly, almost like a nudge, a pause, a subtle tightening in your spirit, a sense that something is not what it appears to be. This is discernment, and if you have walked with God through enough hidden battles, you already know how often this gift has tried to protect you before your mind had enough evidence to agree. Discernment is not suspicion dressed in religious language. It is not fear, cynicism, or the habit of assuming the worst about people. It is the God-given ability to perceive spiritual texture beneath visible form. It helps you recognize when a smile carries envy behind it, when an opportunity carries compromise inside it, when a conversation is steering you away from peace, and when a situation that looks harmless is actually carrying a deeper weight than others can see. One reason this weapon goes unused is because many people have been trained to distrust what their spirit perceives unless it can be quickly justified with logic. They override holy discomfort because they do not want to seem dramatic. They explain away warning signs because they want to be fair. They talk themselves out of what God is revealing because they are afraid of being wrong. And while humility matters, there is a dangerous kind of self-doubt that leaves you exposed. Not every open door is from God. Not every kind word is safe. Not every connection is assigned to help you. Discernment guards you from the mistake of calling everything good just because it looks polished. The enemy rarely introduces destruction in its final form. It usually comes disguised as convenience, urgency, charm, flattery, or emotional intensity. You may have lived through this already. You may have felt uneasy around someone everyone else praised. You may have sensed pressure beneath a seemingly generous offer. You may have entered a room and felt your peace shift before anyone even spoke. That does not make you strange. It does not make you negative. It may mean your spirit is detecting what appearances are trying to hide. God often protects His people by letting them feel misalignment before they can explain it. The problem is that many chosen ones have been conditioned to suppress that signal. They stay too long. They explain too much. They wait for proof when wisdom was already whispering. Then later, when the truth surfaces, they look back and realize they were warned early. Discernment then is not meant to make you fearful of life. It is meant to make you skillful in it. It teaches you not to move only by pressure chemistry or external shine. It trains you to ask deeper questions. What is the fruit of this? What happens to your peace after certain interactions? Does this invitation strengthen your walk with God, or pull you away from center? Is this urgency truly divine, or is it manipulation wearing the costume of timing? These questions are not overthinking when they are guided by the Spirit. They are part of spiritual maturity. Discernment slows you down long enough to see clearly, and that matters because clarity is protection. So many unnecessary wounds begin with misreading what was standing in front of you. Discernment helps you stop calling warning signs coincidence. It helps you honor the inner restraint God places in your spirit. It helps you understand that not everything must be confronted, embraced, or pursued. Some things must simply be recognized. Some people must be loved from a distance. Some doors must be left unopened. Some atmospheres must be exited without long explanations. That is not weakness. That is wisdom carrying a shield. As this weapon wakes up in you, you begin moving differently. You stop chasing what glitters and start weighing what carries peace. You stop letting appearances make decisions for you. You start trusting that God can show you what eyes alone cannot read. And once you begin to see beyond surfaces, you are far less likely to be ruled by them. From there, another weapon begins to rise naturally because once discernment reveals the battle, you need a way to answer it, and that answer leads you straight into prayer. Once discernment begins to sharpen you, start noticing something that changes the way you face pressure. You realize that seeing the battle is not the same as winning it. Recognizing tension, manipulation, heaviness, or confusion is important, but recognition alone does not shift an atmosphere. It only reveals that something deeper is happening. This is where prayer stops being a routine religious habit and becomes what it was always meant to be, a spiritual weapon that reaches into places your hands cannot touch and your words alone cannot repair. Prayer is not the decoration of a faithful life. It is one of the main ways heaven's authority enters your lived reality. Many people know how to talk about prayer, but far fewer know how to lean on it when resistance becomes real. They pray casually when things are calm, but when pressure intensifies, they often panic, overthink, vent to the wrong people, or try to solve spiritually rooted problems with mental strain alone. You may have done this yourself. You may have spent hours rehearsing conversations in your head, trying to decode other people's intentions, carrying burdens God never asked you to carry in your own strength. And all the while, prayer waited like an unopened gate. Not because God was far, but because your mind had become so crowded that you forgot where real help was found. Prayer is powerful because it interrupts that crowding. It draws you out of emotional spirals and places you back into communion. It reminds you that you are not trapped inside your own perspective. You are standing before the God who sees what you cannot see, who understands what you cannot untangle, and who is never confused by the complexity of your situation. When you pray, you are not informing God of something He missed. You are aligning yourself with His presence, His wisdom, His strength, and His timing. That alignment alone can begin to break invisible resistance. A room may not change instantly. A person may not transform overnight. But something in you begins to come back into order. And that inner order matters more than many people realize. Because one of the enemy's favorite strategies is to scatter you internally. If he cannot always destroy you outwardly, he will try to fragment you inwardly. He will push you toward mental exhaustion, emotional reactivity, and spiritual numbness. He will make you feel that everything must be handled immediately, that every discomfort needs an answer now, that every threat must be met with fear or force. Prayer pushes back against that lie. It slows the flood. It recenters your soul. It gives you room to hear again. That is why some of your most important prayers may not sound dramatic at all. Sometimes they are as simple as, God, show me what this really is. Sometimes they are, Father, keep my spirit clean in this. Sometimes they are, lead me, because I do not want to move from panic. These kinds of prayers are not small. They are acts of war against confusion. And prayer does something else that is easy to miss. It reminds you that you do not fight alone. Chosen ones often carry an unusual burden because they have grown used to enduring silently. They become strong in ways others admire, but that very strength can tempt them into isolation. They begin to believe they must carry every burden privately, decode every battle alone, survive every attack through endurance only. But prayer breaks that lonely pattern. It is where self-reliance softens and trust becomes active. It is where you stop treating God like a distant observer and start living as though He is truly involved in the details of your life. The more you use this weapon, the more you notice that prayer is not weakness before action. It is often the action that matters most. It clears the static. It exposes what is false. It steadies what is shaking. And once prayer has quieted the inner noise, another weapon becomes far easier to use, because now your spirit is better positioned to receive the truth that cuts through confusion completely, and that truth is found in the Word. When prayer has done its quiet work and the storm inside you begins to settle, you become able to receive something with greater precision than before, and that is the Word of God. Not as a familiar collection of verses you have heard since childhood. Not as a decorative source of comfort you reach for only when life becomes overwhelming, but as a living weapon that cuts through confusion with a clarity your emotions alone cannot produce. There are seasons when your greatest battle is not external opposition, but internal distortion. Your feelings become loud, your fears become persuasive, your memories become selective, and suddenly what is false starts sounding reasonable. In moments like that, you do not merely need relief. You need truth sharp enough to separate what is real from what only feels real. This is why Scripture is described as something active, something able to divide and expose. The Word does not flatter your confusion. It confronts it. It does not always comfort you by agreeing with your mood. Sometimes it comforts you by correcting your vision. That correction is mercy. Because when you are tired, hurt, or spiritually pressured, your mind can start making alliances with ideas that were never meant to stay in you. You may begin to believe that delay means abandonment, that rejection means worthlessness, that silence from others means silence from God, or that one painful chapter defines the whole story of your life. The word comes into that inner fog like a blade, not to wound you, but to free you from lies that have wrapped themselves around your thinking. That is why this weapon matters so deeply for chosen ones. If your calling carries weight, then confusion will often try to sit close to your mind, not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it comes through subtle exaggeration. It tells you things will never change. It tells you people have more power over your future than they really do. It tells you your weakness disqualifies you. It tells you your weariness is proof that you are failing. And because these thoughts often arrive during emotionally vulnerable moments, they can feel convincing. But feeling convincing is not the same as being true. The word teaches you to challenge what enters your mind. It gives you language higher than panic. It gives you perspective stronger than mood. You may have noticed that when a verse truly lands in your spirit at the right time, it does more than inspire you. It stabilizes you. It reminds you who God is when your circumstances try to redefine Him. It reminds you who you are when pressure tries to reduce you to fear, shame, or reaction. This is not motivational thinking. This is spiritual realignment. The enemy thrives in vagueness, distortion, and mental clutter. The word interrupts all three. It names what is holy. It exposes what is false. It restores order where thoughts have become tangled. But for this weapon to work as it should, you cannot treat it like emergency medicine alone. It has to live close to you, not as performance, not as religious pressure, but as nourishment and training. The word forms your inner reflexes. It changes what rises in you when life presses hard. Without it, your reactions are more likely to be shaped by old wounds, cultural noise, or raw emotion. With it, your spirit becomes more anchored. You begin to answer fear with truth, temptation with truth, accusation with truth, and weariness with truth. That does not mean you stop feeling human emotion. It means emotion no longer gets the final word, and this is where something beautiful begins to happen. Prayer opens the conversation, and the word gives shape to what God is strengthening inside you. Together, they begin rebuilding your inner world. You stop being tossed so easily by every atmosphere, every opinion, every disappointment. You begin to stand with more steadiness because truth is no longer something outside you. It is becoming part of how you see. And once truth starts settling that deeply, another weapon awakens almost naturally, because when lies lose their grip, faith becomes much harder to shake. As the word begins to steady your inner life, faith rises in a different way than many people expect. It is no longer just a beautiful idea you admire from a distance or a hopeful feeling that appears when circumstances look promising. It becomes a weapon and not a soft one. Real faith has a spine. It knows how to remain standing when visible proof is late, when pressure intensifies, and when the enemy tries to convince you that delay means defeat. Faith is not denial. It does not pretend pain is pleasant or pressure is imaginary. It simply refuses to give darkness the authority to define the final outcome before God speaks. This matters because many chosen ones are not defeated by one dramatic event. They are worn down over time. They grow tired of waiting, tired of hoping, tired of carrying themselves with dignity while answers seem slow to arrive. And in that weariness, the temptation is not always to abandon God completely. More often, the temptation is to quietly lower your expectation, to stop believing deeply, to settle for spiritual numbness so disappointment cannot sting as much. That is where faith becomes warfare. Because faith says even here, even now, even without visible confirmation, God is still God. His timing is still intelligent, and what He began is not abandoned because I cannot yet see the finished shape of it. Faith protects you from collapsing into the false authority of appearances. The visible world can be persuasive, Closed doors look final. Silence looks like absence. Repeated obstacles look like rejection. But faith trains you not to hand over your spiritual posture to whatever happens to be in front of you today. It teaches you to live from a deeper reference point, not from denial, but from covenant, not from fantasy, but from trust. You begin to understand that what is seen is not always the most important layer of reality. God can be arranging, restraining, redirecting, and preparing in ways you do not yet have language for. Faith lets you remain connected to that unseen work instead of interpreting every unfinished chapter as failure. And this kind of faith is not loud performance. It is often quiet, almost hidden. It looks like continuing to obey when shortcuts seem easier. It looks like guarding your heart when bitterness would feel more natural. It looks like praying again after a long silence. It looks like refusing to call yourself forgotten just because the season is stretching you. It looks like staying tender before God when disappointment tries to harden you into self-protection. That tenderness is not weakness. It is strength under surrender. It is a soul that has decided not to become cynical just because life has been difficult. You may already know how hard this can be. There are seasons when faith feels expensive. Seasons when trusting God seems to cost you the immediate relief of taking matters into your own hands. Seasons when others misunderstand your stillness and assume nothing is happening. But heaven sees something different. Heaven sees a person refusing to kneel to panic. Heaven sees someone choosing not to build their identity around temporary evidence. Heaven sees someone whose roots are growing deeper precisely because the surface feels dry. This is why faith is such a feared weapon in the spirit. It keeps you connected to God beyond visible outcomes, and anything that keeps you connected to God weakens the enemy's power to define your emotional world. So faith is not merely believing that good things may happen someday. It is the active refusal to let fear, delay, pain, or uncertainty become your teacher. It is choosing again and again to interpret your life through God's character rather than through your worst moment. And once faith begins holding you that steadily, it prepares you for another weapon that often looks small to the untrained eye, yet carries enormous power in real life, because the next thing God uses to protect and position you is obedience. Once faith has taught you how to remain standing without constant visible proof, obedience begins to take on a different meaning in your life. It stops looking like a small religious duty and starts revealing itself as one of the most underestimated spiritual weapons God has given you. Because obedience is not merely about proving devotion. It is about alignment. It is about staying close enough to God's instruction that your life remains positioned under wisdom you could never have produced by instinct alone. And that matters more than many people realize, because some of the greatest dangers in your life do not arrive looking evil. They arrive looking efficient, justified, or emotionally satisfying. Obedience protects you from what seems right in the moment, but carries consequences your current feelings cannot yet detect. This is why obedience often feels deceptively simple while carrying enormous power. God may tell you not to go somewhere, not to reply, yet not to trust too quickly, not to force an outcome, not to attach yourself to a person simply because the connection feels intense, not to step outside of integrity just because the pressure is high. And the flesh does not always like that. Your emotions may argue. Your impatience may protest. Your logic may present a whole case for why a shortcut seems harmless, but obedience is the weapon that keeps you from trading long-term protection for short-term relief. It saves you from becoming vulnerable in the exact places where the enemy hoped your frustration would make you careless. You have probably seen this in your own life more than once. There were moments when obeying God did not make immediate sense. Yet later you realized that what felt restrictive was actually protective. A delay spared you. A closed door preserved you. A quiet instruction prevented entanglement. A season of waiting kept you from stepping into something that looked exciting but would have drained your peace, fractured your focus, or wounded your spirit. At the time, obedience may have felt inconvenient, even painful. But hindsight revealed the mercy hidden inside the instruction. That is one of the mysteries of walking with God. His commands are not chains, they are coverings. They are not there to shrink your life. They are there to keep your life from being pulled out of alignment by things that only look harmless from a distance. And this is especially important for chosen ones because when your life carries purpose, you will often face pressure to move ahead of God, speak ahead of God, or attach meaning to things God never assigned. The enemy does not always need you to commit some dramatic failure. Sometimes he only needs you to move prematurely, to say yes too soon, to trust the wrong voice, to act while agitated, to step out from under God's timing because the discomfort of waiting begins to feel unbearable. That is why obedience is warfare. It keeps your life from being steered by urgency. It trains you to respect divine timing over emotional momentum. It teaches you that peace is often preserved not by doing more, but by staying where God told you to stand. There is also a quiet authority that grows in you through obedience. Every time you choose God's instruction over your impulse, something becomes stronger in your spirit. You become less easily manipulated by fear, less seduced by appearances, less vulnerable to flattery, less likely to mistake motion for progress. Obedience simplifies your inner world. It frees you from many unnecessary battles because it removes the chaos that comes from stepping outside your covering. It does not make life trouble-free, but it makes your steps cleaner. And clean steps carry a kind of confidence that reckless striving never can. This weapon also humbles you in a holy way. It reminds you that not every answer must come from your own brilliance. Not every breakthrough depends on your ability to control outcomes. Sometimes your greatest strength is your willingness to follow. To trust that God sees what you do not. To believe that His no can protect you as much as His yes can bless you. To accept that divine wisdom is not always immediately comfortable, but it is always deeper than your temporary appetite. And when obedience becomes part of your reflex, another weapon begins to unfold almost naturally, because a heart that follows God closely will eventually discover the power of honoring Him even in the middle of battle. That is where worship begins to rise, not as background music for your pain, but as a force that reorders the atmosphere within and around you. By the time obedience has begun to steady your steps, worship starts to reveal itself in a way far deeper than many people were ever taught to understand. It is no longer just a song, a church moment, or a beautiful expression saved for times when life feels soft and blessed. It becomes a weapon, and one of the most transformative weapons God places in your hands, because worship does something battle cannot do by force alone. It reorders you. It lifts your focus above the pressure pressing against you. It reminds your soul who God is before your circumstances get the chance to tell you who He is not. And that is why worship carries such spiritual weight. It does not merely make you feel better. It shifts the atmosphere in which fear, heaviness, and inner turmoil try to survive. You have likely experienced this in quiet moments, even if you did not yet have language for it. There were times when your mind felt crowded, your emotions felt tight, and your spirit felt worn thin, yet the moment you turned your attention toward God in sincere reverence, something began to loosen. The problem may not have disappeared instantly. The unanswered questions may still have remained, but the grip of panic weakened. The heaviness became less absolute. Your perspective began to widen again. That is not imagination. That is one of the hidden powers of worship. It interrupts the rule of emotional chaos by placing God back at the center of your awareness. And this is exactly why the enemy fights worship so subtly. He does not always try to ban it outright. Often he simply tries to make you postpone it. He makes worship feel optional, secondary, or reserved only for moments when you already feel strong. He fills your mind with noise and your schedule with clutter so that your attention stays chained to the immediate weight of life. Because as long as your gaze remains fixed only on the problem appears larger than it truly is. Worship breaks that illusion. It does not deny that the battle is real. It simply refuses to let the battle become bigger in your eyes than the God who reigns above it. This is what makes worship such a fierce weapon for chosen ones. When your path has been marked by unusual strain, spiritual tension, or long seasons of hidden warfare, your inner world can become tired in ways other people do not always understand. You may still believe in God while feeling emotionally worn. You may still pray while struggling to feel light. You may still endure while carrying a heaviness that words do not easily explain. Worship enters that place differently. It does not always begin with explanation. It begins with surrender, awe, remembrance, and honor. It tells your soul, even here, God is worthy. Even here, He is holy. Even here. He is not reduced by what I am facing. And when your soul starts speaking that way, darkness loses room to dominate your emotional landscape. Worship also restores order to your loves. It reminds you that your deepest need is not control, not instant resolution, not visible validation, but nearness to God. That is a profound realignment. Because when fear rules you, begin craving quick relief above all else. When worship rises, your spirit remembers that peace is found first in presence, not in perfect circumstances. From that place, you become harder to shake. Not because your life suddenly becomes easy, but because your heart is no longer feeding on the same panic that once weakened you. Worship changes what nourishes you. It turns your attention from threat to throne, from pressure to presence, from self-protection to reverence. And once worship begins reordering you like that, another weapon comes into view with surprising force, because one of the ways God preserves what worship restores is through holy restraint. After your heart has been lifted back into alignment, you become more capable of recognizing that not every battle should be answered with more words. Some battles are weakened when you stop feeding them. Some traps collapse when you refuse to react. That is where silence begins to reveal its power. As worship restores order inside you, silence begins to look less like absence and more like strength under government. This is one of the weapons people misunderstand the most, because many have been taught that power always looks like immediate response, sharp explanation, or visible self-defense. But some of the most costly battles in your life were never won by speaking more. They were worsened by speaking too soon, reacting from pain, or trying to force clarity in moments God was calling you to restraint. Holy silence is not passivity. It is not fear. It is not the surrender of truth. It is the disciplined refusal to let wounded emotion choose your words before wisdom has had time to lead them. This weapon matters because the enemy often studies your reactions more closely than your intentions. He watches for agitation, exhaustion, offense, insecurity, and urgency. He looks for the moment when pain becomes impulsive enough to make you say what should have been left unsaid. Expose what should have remained covered, or defend yourself in ways that drain your authority instead of strengthening it. That is why silence can be such fierce protection. It starves traps that depend on your reaction. It blocks the escalation that conflict feeds on. It denies darkness the satisfaction of pulling your spirit down into noise that was never worthy of your peace. You may already know the bitter aftertaste of reacting too quickly. You say something in a heated moment, and even if part of it is true, the timing contaminates it. You explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, and the explanation becomes another tool for distortion. You try to clear your name in the wrong atmosphere, and the more you speak, the less clean the situation feels. Many chosen ones learn this lesson painfully, because when you carry sincerity, you often want truth to be understood. You want fairness. You want clarity. You want people to see what really happened. But not every audience is prepared to honor truth, and not every confrontation is assigned to produce peace. Silence protects you from wasting spiritual energy in rooms where wisdom has already told you not to fight for approval. That does not mean you never speak. Silence is not avoidance pretending to be maturity. There are times God tells you to speak clearly, to set boundaries, to tell the truth without apology. But holy silence teaches you to wait until your speech is governed rather than driven. It trains you to ask, is this the right moment, the right audience, the right motive, the right tone? Am I speaking to honor God or to soothe my pride? Am I trying to clarify truth, or am I trying to escape the discomfort of being misunderstood? These are humbling questions, but they save you from many traps. Because when speech comes from inner steadiness instead of emotional flooding, it carries a different weight. It becomes cleaner, stronger, and far less available for manipulation. Silence is also where God often does some of his deepest work in you. In the pause before reaction, hidden things rise to the surface. You begin to see your own wounds more honestly. You notice where pride wants the last word, where fear wants control, where insecurity wants validation, where pain wants to strike back. This can feel uncomfortable, but it is deeply freeing. Because every moment of restraint creates space for God to purify your motives. Silence does not only protect you from others, it protects you from becoming someone your pain was trying to invent. And there is another mystery here. Silence often increases discernment. The less noise you produce, the more clearly you can hear what is actually happening. You begin to catch tone, timing, and spiritual texture with greater precision. You stop being swept away by the urgency of the moment. You become less readable to manipulation because your reflex is no longer instant reaction. That is powerful. A soul that cannot be easily baited is difficult to control. So silence is not emptiness. It is guarded strength. It is reverence for timing. It is trust that God can defend what needs defending without your panic helping him. And once you begin living with that kind of restraint, your heart becomes ready for one of the hardest and strongest weapons of all. Because after silence has taught you not to be ruled by hurt, God begins teaching you how love and forgiveness can break chains that anger never could. Section 9. After silence has trained you not to answer every wound with immediate reaction, you are brought into one of the most demanding truths of the spiritual life. And for many chosen ones, this is where the battle becomes especially deep. Because now God begins to show you that love and forgiveness are not sentimental ideas designed to make you passive. They are weapons, strong ones, difficult ones, often costly ones. And yet few things protect your spirit more powerfully than refusing to let bitterness become part of your inner architecture. Bitterness feels justified when you have been mishandled, overlooked, misread, betrayed, or quietly targeted. It offers itself like armor. It promises strength. It tells you that hardness will keep you safe where softness once left you exposed. But bitterness is a counterfeit shield. It does not only block pain, it also blocks peace, clarity, tenderness, and spiritual authority. It keeps you bound to the very thing you are trying to rise above. This is why forgiveness is such a feared weapon in the unseen battle. The enemy does not merely want you hurt. He wants your hurt to become a permanent lens. He wants pain to become your interpreter, your counselor, your reflex, your emotional climate. He wants you reading every new situation through the residue of the last betrayal. He wants your trust in God weakened by your disappointment in people. He wants your heart so burdened by old offenses that your spiritual sensitivity becomes heavy, crowded, and distorted. But forgiveness interrupts that entire strategy. Forgiveness says this pain will not become my identity. This wound will not be given the authority to shape how I carry God's presence. This offense may have reached me, but it will not own me. That does not mean forgiveness is easy. It is often one of the slowest acts of obedience because real pain does not disappear just because you understand the principle. Some injuries go deep. Some betrayals touch places in you that were already tired. Some wounds are not dramatic enough for public sympathy, but heavy enough to quietly alter how you move through life. And because of that, people sometimes confuse forgiveness with pretending. They think forgiving means minimizing what happened, excusing injustice, or granting instant access to those who proved untrustworthy. But forgiveness is not denial. It does not rewrite evil as good. It does not call betrayal harmless. It does not erase the need for boundaries, wisdom, distance, or truth. Forgiveness is the decision to release your inner life from the prison of perpetual retaliation. It is the refusal to keep drinking from the poison of replayed injury. You can feel the difference when you begin to understand this properly. Love and forgiveness do not make you naive, they make you free. They keep your spirit from hardening into something that may look strong from the outside while quietly bleeding strength on the inside. Because the truth is, anger has energy, but it does not have peace. Resentment has intensity, but it does not have vision. Bitterness can make you sharp, but it cannot make you whole. It narrows your world until everything becomes about what was taken, what was said, what was unfair, what should have happened differently. And when that narrowing continues long enough, you begin living in reaction to the past instead of in response to God. That is why forgiveness is warfare. It breaks the emotional agreement that keeps old pain sitting on the throne of your inner world. And this is especially important for chosen ones because people who carry genuine light often attract misunderstanding. Not always because they are perfect, but because light exposes what darkness would rather leave undisturbed. When your life begins moving in deeper alignment with God, you will sometimes face resistance that is less about your actions than about what your presence awakens in others. Some will project onto you. Some will resent what they cannot control. Some will distance themselves because your growth quietly confronts their stagnation. Some will wound you while calling themselves justified. If you do not understand forgiveness as a weapon, these experiences can make you guarded in all the wrong ways. You may still look composed, but inside you begin withholding tenderness from God, from life, from people who never harmed you. That is not protection, that is pain expanding its territory. Love in the biblical sense pushes against that expansion. Not fragile love, not performative niceness, not people-pleasing disguised as spirituality, but strong, holy love rooted in God's own character. This kind of love does not need to chase approval. It does not panic when boundaries are necessary. It does not stay where abuse is normalized, but it refuses hatred as an identity. It refuses contempt as a lifestyle. It refuses to let another person's darkness decide the quality of your spirit. That is why love is powerful. It preserves your resemblance to Christ in places where pain tries to rewrite your nature. You may have noticed that the hardest people to forgive are not always the most openly cruel. Sometimes it is those who are close enough to matter, the ones who knew enough about you to wound with precision. The ones from whom you expected safety, honesty, loyalty, maturity, or simple fairness. Those wounds leave echoes. They do not just hurt the moment they happen. They continue speaking afterward, trying to convince you that openness is dangerous, that sincerity is foolish, that giving your heart to God's way leaves you unprotected. But this is where forgiveness becomes one of your fiercest acts of spiritual resistance. Because every time you refuse to let old pain define your future posture, you are telling heaven and hell alike that what happened to you will not become greater than what God is forming in you. And sometimes forgiveness begins in very small ways. Not with a dramatic emotional breakthrough, but with a prayer you have to pray more than once. Father, I release my right to revenge. Father, remove from me what this wound is trying to grow. Father, heal what still flinches when I remember. Father, teach me how to let go without pretending it did not matter. These prayers matter. They are not weak. They are chisels in God's hand. They break stones loose little by little. They clear space in you where peace can return. Because forgiveness is not always a single moment. Sometimes it is a season of repeated surrender until the wound loses its throne and becomes just one part of a story God is redeeming. And love, once restored, becomes protective in ways anger never can. It sharpens discernment without poisoning it. It supports boundaries without turning them into walls around your whole identity. It keeps your faith soft before God, even while your wisdom becomes stronger with people. This is one of the beautiful paradoxes of spiritual maturity. You can become less naive and more loving at the same time. You can learn from pain without worshiping it. You can remember what happened without living beneath it. You can bless without returning to bondage. You can forgive without offering unrestricted access. That balance is not weakness. It is spiritual intelligence shaped by grace. There is also something else forgiveness does that many people overlook. It restores authority to your prayers. Not because God only hears perfect people, but because unresolved bitterness clouds intimacy. It fills the inner room with noise. It keeps part of your heart turned backward. But when forgiveness begins doing its work, your communion with God becomes cleaner again. Not because every scar is gone, but because you are no longer feeding the scar with constant agreement. Your spirit becomes lighter. Your worship becomes freer. Your discernment becomes clearer. Your silence becomes less defensive. Your obedience becomes less burdened by hidden grief. In this way, forgiveness is not isolated from the other weapons. It protects them. It keeps the whole inner arsenal from rusting beneath resentment. So by now you can see why heaven takes this so seriously. The enemy would rather have you openly angry than honestly healed, because anger can be steered. He would rather have you rehearsing offenses than recognizing your authority, because an offended soul spends its energy circling pain instead of walking in purpose. But God is calling you into something cleaner than that. He is not asking you to become numb. He is asking you to become free. Not free from memory, not free from wisdom, not free from the lessons suffering taught you, but free from the invisible chains that try to keep your spirit tied to what should no longer rule you. And once you begin to understand love and forgiveness this way, you are ready for the final gathering together of everything that has been unfolding. Because these weapons were never scattered ideas, they were a complete inheritance. Discernment, prayer, the word, faith, obedience, worship, silence, love, and forgiveness have all been shaping you toward one great recognition. You were never sent into this life spiritually empty. You were given what you need. The question now is whether you will take up what heaven already placed in your hands and walk forward with it fully awake. Now, everything begins to gather into one clear and living truth. None of these weapons were ever separate pieces meant to remain scattered in your life. They form a whole way of walking with God. They are not decorative virtues for admired believers. They are the actual means by which heaven trains you to live protected, clear-grounded, and spiritually awake in a world that constantly tries to pull you out of alignment. And what becomes unmistakable now is this: God has not been withholding what you need. The deeper invitation of this message is not to wait for some future empowerment as though heaven forgot to equip you. It is to recognize with sober gratitude that much of what you have been praying for has already been placed within your reach: your spirit, your habits, your attention, your obedience, your inner posture before God. This changes the emotional tone of your whole journey. Because when you believe you are unequipped, you move through life with a kind of hidden desperation. You become overly impressed by loud people, dramatic signs, urgent voices, and outward strength. You feel vulnerable in every unfamiliar atmosphere. You search outside yourself for constant reassurance. You overvalue what glitters because you feel disconnected from what is solid. But when you begin to understand that God has already given you a spiritual inheritance, you stop moving like someone abandoned in the middle of battle. You begin moving like someone being trained. Not hurried, not arrogant, not severe, but awake. There is a difference. Desperation grasps. Maturity discerns. Desperation reacts. Maturity listens. Desperation tries to force certainty. Maturity learns how to stand in God without demanding instant answers. And this is where many chosen ones quietly cross a threshold in their spiritual life. Not because the world suddenly becomes easier, but because they stop relating to every challenge as though it is proof of weakness. They begin asking different questions. Instead of, "Why is this happening to me?" they begin asking, "What has God already given me for this moment?" Instead of, "How do I escape this feeling as quickly as possible?" they ask, "Which weapon have I neglected here? Is this a moment for discernment? Is this a moment for prayer? Is this a moment to return to the Word until confusion loses its voice? Is this a moment for faith that refuses appearances? Is this a moment for obedience when the flesh wants speed?" Is this a moment for worship when heaviness tries to rule? Is this a moment for silence rather than explanation? Is this a moment for love and forgiveness so that pain does not gain a foothold, that shift in questions is not small? It is the beginning of spiritual adulthood. Because now you are no longer merely hoping for rescue while ignoring formation. You are learning to cooperate with God in real time. You are beginning to see that some answers arrive not as escape routes, but as inner equipment. God does rescue. God does intervene. God does make ways where there seem to be none. But many of his most faithful interventions come through the very weapons he has already taught you to use. Through discernment that makes you pause. Through prayer that steadies your soul before panic spreads. Through scripture that corrects your internal distortion. Through faith that outlasts what is visible. Through obedience that keeps you from stepping outside your covering. Through worship that restores perspective. Through silence that protects your authority. Through forgiveness that keeps your spirit from becoming heavy and hard. And perhaps this is what your recent season has really been about. Perhaps the reason life has felt so exposing at times is that God has been revealing where you still try to live without using what he gave you. Not to shame you, but to awaken you, because love tells the truth, and God's love is too deep to let you remain spiritually passive forever. There comes a point when he begins to deal with you more directly. He lets you feel the exhaustion of overreacting so you can learn the strength of silence. He lets you see the futility of overthinking so you can return to prayer. He lets the instability of emotion reveal your need for the word. He lets delay stretch you until faith becomes more than theory. He lets wrong doors expose the necessity of obedience. He lets heaviness teach you the forgotten power of worship. He lets hurt uncover the poison of resentment so forgiveness can become real. In this way, even your frustrations have been part of your training. So now the question is not whether these weapons are real. The question is whether you will take responsibility for using them. And that responsibility is not a burden meant to make you strive. It is an invitation into partnership. God is not asking you to become your own savior. He is asking you to stop living as though he left you defenseless. There is a holy dignity that begins to rise in a person who accepts this. You stop seeing yourself only as someone under attack, and you begin seeing yourself as someone under instruction. You stop interpreting every difficult moment as chaos and begin discerning which spiritual response belongs there. Your life becomes less about random reaction and more about trained response. That is how peace grows. That is how authority deepens. That is how calling matures without needing applause. And let this be said clearly because it matters. Using your spiritual weapons does not mean becoming harsh, suspicious, emotionally frozen, or self-righteous. It does not mean using scripture to dominate people's silence, to punish people, obedience to perform holiness, or discernment to make yourself feel superior. Every weapon God gives is meant to keep you close to his character, not far from it. The proof that you are using them rightly is not that you become harder and louder. It is that you become cleaner, steadier, humbler, clearer, and more difficult for darkness to manipulate. There is a holy gentleness that comes with real strength. A person who is truly anchored in God does not need to advertise power. It shows in their restraint, their clarity, their patience, their capacity to remain aligned without panicking when life becomes uncertain. So this is where you stand now. Not at the end of a motivational idea, but at the edge of a decision. You can keep moving through life half aware, praying for change, while neglecting the tools God already gave you. Or you can begin slowly and sincerely to take them up. You can start honoring the warnings discernment gives. You can return to prayer before anxiety builds kingdoms in your mind. You can let the word stay near enough to interrupt lies before they settle in. You can practice faith when evidence is incomplete. You can obey faster than your emotions protest. You can worship before the atmosphere tells you not to. You can choose silence when reaction would cost too much. You can forgive before pain calcifies. None of this has to happen perfectly in one day, but it does have to become intentional. That is how neglected inheritance becomes lived authority. And maybe that is the sentence your spirit has been waiting for all along. You do not need to become someone else to walk in spiritual strength. You need to awaken to what God has already entrusted to you. He has been more faithful than you knew. He has been equipping you through lessons, pressures, pauses, warnings, and invitations that you are only now beginning to name. The arsenal was never absent. It was simply underused, but that can change from this moment onward. You can walk differently now. You can fight differently now. You can respond differently now. Because the same God who called you is the God who equipped you, and what He placed in your hands was never meant to remain asleep. So as you move forward from here, let this truth stay close. You are not empty, not forgotten, not exposed, and not unequipped. You are being taught how to use what heaven already placed inside your life. And once that becomes real to you, the battles may not disappear, but you will no longer meet them as the same person. You will meet them with awareness, with alignment, with steadiness, with holy intelligence, with weapons that do not draw attention to you but draw you nearer to God. And that is where real victory has always begun. As this message comes to rest, let yourself breathe for a moment without rushing back into noise. You do not have to leave this with pressure on your shoulders. You do not have to turn every truth into performance. Let it settle gently. The point was never to make you feel late. The point was to help you see more clearly. God is patient with your process. He is not standing over you with accusation because some weapons were underused. He is drawing you closer with understanding because awakening always begins with mercy. What matters now is not your past inconsistency. What matters is your present willingness. A willing heart in God's hands can grow stronger than fear expects. So carry this into the coming days with calm seriousness. Pay attention to what your spirit notices. Return to prayer before confusion becomes your atmosphere. Stay near the Word until your thoughts remember their proper order. Let faith remain when visible proof delays. Let obedience protect what emotion would endanger. Let worship lift your gaze. Let silence guard your peace. Let forgiveness keep your inner life clean. Do not try to master all of it in one dramatic effort. Live it steadily. One response at a time. One surrendered moment at a time. One wise decision at a time. Because that is how spiritual strength usually grows. Not with spectacle, but with repeated alignment. Not in one grand public moment, but in the private places where your heart learns to agree with God more quickly than before. And as that happens, you will notice that what once overwhelmed you no longer controls you in the same way. The battle may still exist, but your posture within it begins to change. You become less scattered, less baited, less easily deceived, more anchored, more discerning, more peaceful, more whole. Hold on to that. God has given more to you than you once realized. And now you know enough to begin walking in it with new awareness.